Thank you, Jim, and I'd like to welcome all of you for joining us in the Freedom Committee of Orange County, the hard-working sponsors of this event. It's our mission, to pass the torch of freedom to future generations. And the wall that you see here is a faithful replica of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. Washington is a city of monuments, and the Vietnam Memorial is just one of many commemorating in wars our history from the birth of the nation forward. The actual memorial, is in Washington, D.C., finished in 1983, as you heard. I went to see it shortly after it was commissioned, and I was really disappointed. And I wasn't the only one. Like the war itself, the monument was controversial. To me, it looked like a gloomy, sad thing carved into a hill. Not what I expected. I thought it did not adequately pay tribute to the valor of those whose names you see here. Gradually, I became more appreciative of the meaning of the wall. Unlike all the other monuments, it was unlike all the other monuments, and that's fitting because the war was unlike all the other wars we fought. Thanks to exhibits like this, though, America now has a new appreciation for that conflict of over 50 years ago. The wall is one of the most frequently visited and recognizable monuments now in all of D.C. As you heard, there are over 58,000 names on that wall, and I always think that behind each of those names, there's probably a dozen people, fathers, husbands, children, aunts, uncles, grandparents, all who suffered that loss. Many things set the Vietnam War apart from all the others. For one thing, we're not sure when it started for us. Probably in the late 50s, but we do know it ended in 1973, which made it the longest war we ever fought up until that time. At one time, we had over 500,000 troops on the line in Vietnam. And although the Army never lost a major battle, opposition to the war, which began on the college campuses and was encouraged by an anti-war media, soon progressed as the war dragged on. Eventually, the general population turned against the war, and they took out their frustration on the troops. I never quite understood that, but many returning vets were treated poorly, and this was a shameful time in our nation's history. I hope that we put that all behind us and never let that happen again. This phrase, thank you for your service, a lot of Vietnam veterans never heard that until decades after their tour. This is a very recent commendation to our veterans, and they really appreciate it. I was an Air Force pilot, and the Vietnam combat tour was normally 1 year. I served mine in 1971. But during the 3 years prior to my combat tour, I flew C-141 four-engine jet transports out of a place called Dover, Delaware on the East Coast. And as you might imagine, these giant airlifters were the chief supply line to Vietnam. There were over 150 of these airplanes on the West Coast and 150 on the East Coast, and we were a veritable air bridge. That is how the war to Vietnam was supplied. During this time, I carried everything besides the troops to the fighting forces, ammunition, guns, all the necessities from jungle boots to vehicles. One time I even took in 50 sentry zones to the war zone. The route was a great circle route. We'd take off from the east coast of the U.S., fly up to Alaska, down to Japan, and into Vietnam and back out again. We spent very little time on the ground in Vietnam. We just offloaded the aircraft, unloaded what we were taking back. It was an 8,000-mile journey through 13 time zones. I did that three times a month for 3 years. After offloading our cargo in Vietnam, the plane would frequently be turned into a medical evacuation plane, a flying hospital, with 80 stretcher litters stretched from the top of the airplane to the bottom of the cargo floor. Another 20 airline seats would be installed for the walking wounded, all under the supervision of those heroic flight nurses, the unsung heroines of the war. That's when I saw the real cost of war. But we were able to get some of these wounded GIs to an American hospital in less than 30 hours from the time they were injured. Other times, the outbound cargo would be the flag-draped coffins of those whose names you see here on the wall. I brought many of those home also, sometimes 50 at a time. During this time, I developed a great admiration for the Army infantry and the U.S. Marines. They say rightly so that the World War II vets were the greatest generation. In my opinion, the Vietnam vets are a special generation. Those who fought in the jungles of Nam endured the toughest conditions of any conflict before or after. Some of them were draftees. They earned my respect. Vietnam veterans truly are our special generation. I saw many instances early on in the conflict where I thought we could have and should have won that war. When one of the main fighter aces of the war, Colonel Robin Olds, was invited to the White House for an attaboy, President Johnson asked him, "What should I do about Vietnam?" The colonel replied, "Let us win it," expressing the frustrations of many. The restrictions on air power during this conflict were unprecedented. Our rules of engagement, the rules we had to fight by, they appeared to be written by the enemy. But I'm not here to revise history, but to recognize those who made it. There are over 250 Medals of Honor awarded to Vietnam warriors, and 62% of them have their names inscribed on that wall. But all the names on that wall and all those who served in Vietnam are true heroes. When you thank a vet for his service, it has a special meaning for that special generation, the 7 million who served during the Vietnam conflict. Again, thanks for coming, and thank you for letting me speak for that special generation.